All right, good evening and welcome to this edition of the Grand Rapids Drupal user group. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Drupal caching. We're going to give a broad overview of the caching system in Drupal and the other types of caching that might affect your web page. We will go into it exactly as deeply as I was able to research in the past hour. So we'll see how that goes. So to start off with, we need to go over the basics of what caching is. So caching in the context of computing is simply trying to avoid doing the same work twice. If you have computed some sort of result and you need that result a second time, you don't want to perform all that work a second time to get the same result. So the simplest example in a programming context is just a variable. Think about the fact that you might call a function and you can print out the results, and then you'd need to print out that result a second time. You could call the function again, or you could store the result in a variable and then not have to call that function again. And that's caching. There's also caching that happens at very low levels in your computer where, for example, there's a cache that stores recent results that were fetched from slow memory, like your disk, so that they don't have to be read from the disk if you need them again, because you often will need the same thing multiple times in a row. So there's fast memory that acts as a cache there. So generally speaking, that's what caching does. And for web pages, there are multiple places where things get slow. They can be slow because it takes a lot of work to produce the page that you're going to see, or they can be slow because it takes a lot of work to transmit that page over the internet. Or it can be slow because once it gets to the destination, it takes a long time to turn that information into a visible web page for the user. So at all of those layers, caching comes into play to speed things up. Usually when you hear cache in the context of a web page, people are talking about the browser's cache, which is the way that we handle not having to request the same information over and over again when we have done that already. And so the browser does some caching there. When you ask someone to clear their cache, that's what we're talking about. But tonight, we're mostly going to talk about the caching that happens in Drupal, because building a complicated web page can take a long time, can involve pulling a lot of data out of the database, doing calculations on that, and coming up with a web page from all of that work. So first off, I want to talk about the simplest kind of caching that Drupal does, which is the static page cache. This is something that ships with Drupal. So here I have a little demo Drupal site that has nothing turned on. It has we're viewing a page that we created that all it does is return a little render array here with the current time. And so when we view this page, when we refresh the page, we can see every time I click reload, we get the new timestamp there. So that's all working as we'd expect. but every time I reload, it has to build this whole page. So there is a module called the internal page cache that ships with Drupal. That is the only caching that existed in Drupal in older versions. And if we install this module, we will see no apparent change here. But if we load that same page without being logged in, I'm going to copy this URL, paste it in here. Okay. Every time I reload this page, it reloads really fast, but the current time doesn't change. And what's happening here is that the internal page cache module, what it does is when a page is fetched by an anonymous user who's not logged in for the first time, it says, okay, I know what happens when you go to that URL, and it saves the final result of that URL to the database. So that the next time an anonymous user goes to that same page, it doesn't have to do any work at all besides pull that result out and show it to people. So if you've got a site that is very simple, but very popular, and you have thousands or more people hammering at the home page, this is going to work wonders because it means that only the first one had to actually do any work. And we can see this also if we look at the database. I can see that there's a table here called cache_page. And what it has in it now is a row where it has a column called CID, that's cache ID. And the ID here is just the URL that we went to. And then it has data that comes out, which is, it's a PHP variable, so it's not beautiful, but you'll see that that pretty soon here it has a key called content with a value of that whole web page. So this is extremely simple, but very useful. So what are the downsides to this? Why isn't this the end of the story? First off, this only works for anonymous users, because if it worked for logged in people and we cached the page when we went there, I'm here as the administrator. If this worked for all users, then I would go to this page, it would get cached, and the next person, anonymous user who comes along and views the page, is going to see all of my administrative controls, which is obviously a bad thing. So the very simple decision is there's a distinction between logged in and not logged in, and only people who aren't logged in get to see the cached version. So that's a limitation. It can only work for anonymous users. Plus, in our example right here, we don't want this time to stay the same forever. We want it to change. And this static page cache, this internal page cache module, doesn't have any way of knowing, hey, something has changed, I need to display a new version of this page. It's pretty dumb. It knows about some things that you might do and can invalidate the whole thing, but mostly it's just time-based and it's going to hold on to things for a while. We can configure that under performance here, but not by much. This is actually has to do with the browser's caching, not that, but we can clear all the caches. And if we do that, then when we refresh this, it'll get a new time, but now it's stuck at that new time. Okay, so this is the basics of the caching that you probably know about already. And for the purposes of our discussion today, I am going to uninstall that module and talk about the much more sophisticated and interesting one. So there is a second module called, it's also part of the core, called the internal dynamic page cache. Okay, when you have this installed, we have, if we look at our database table, this cache page is going to go away because we disabled that module. And in its place, we're going to have some new stuff. So I'm going to go back to this page. And we're going to now see a dynamic page cache that's going to show up. This is also going to have all the markup of the page showing in it, but it's got a lot more stuff going on. And so now we're going to dig into all the things that this one can do. The dynamic page cache is a smart one, and it figures out what to display based on lots of different factors. So let's go through the first thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I had an example out of order here. Before we get to that awesomeness, I'm going to talk about one other kind of caching that's simple. This is static variable caching in Drupal. Okay. This is what I get for not having written down the order in which I was going to say everything. So what I've done is on this, for this example, I'm actually going to turn that module back off just for this demo so that we make sure we don't muddy the waters at all. Okay, so this is going to be another example with no caching turned on at all. Okay, what I wrote here in example 2 is a function that calls a method 10 times that I've called long operation, because that's what it's going to be. So this is going to be a little example to simulate you're doing something that's hard for Drupal to pull off, like loading a dozen nodes and doing something with them. Something that takes a while. And we're going to show some results of that on the page based on what happened there. To simulate that long operation, what I'm doing here is I've got a bunch of data. Let's pretend that was pulled from the database, and we're going to grab one of those items out of that list. But we're going to pretend that took a while. So I put a little statement in here to say, wait a second before returning. So now this page, when I load this one, it'll take one. Okay, so now, I'm on example 1. If I go to example 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we get the result after all that work has happened of all of those items. Okay, so this works, but it's slow. And it didn't really need to be slow because we're saying we're pretending we're getting this back from a database. We didn't have to make that database call 10 times. So how do we make that call only once? Well, what we can do is, this hasn't changed at all. I'm going to keep this exactly the same the way we're calling it. But in the operation that takes a while, we're going to use this function that Drupal gives us called Drupal static. And we're going to say if this Drupal static thing has no value yet, we're going to call the database and populate it with all these results. And then we're going to return the result. So what this does is every time this function gets called, this value is the same one, even though it's a fresh new function call. The value that comes from that Drupal static sticks around. So now the second time this gets called, it doesn't need to call the database at all. It already has the data and can just return it. So when we go to example 3, 1, done. It takes 1 second instead of 10 seconds to do that same work. So you'll see this pattern inside the Drupal core a lot for doing things like loading a node. When you load a node, it only does it once and then it saves the result because it figures you're probably going to do something else with that node elsewhere on the page. Let's not do that over and over again. So this is very simple to use, with the limitation that nothing is stored. So the next page load, it's going to have to do that 1 second of work again. So we've sped things up a little bit, but we haven't sped things up over time. So now we're going to go back into what I was going to say about the dynamic cache. So before I go into the dynamic cache, any questions about that one that I just covered? Okay, so I'll move on now to the dynamic cache. So in example 4, I'm going to solve the problem about the time running out by providing some details here. In a render array, there is a key called cache that we can provide to give what's called cacheability metadata. This lets you tell Drupal something about the content that you are that you're supplying so that it knows when and how to cache it. So if we go back to our anonymous user and go to example 4, this page is in fact not cached because we've told it the maximum possible length of time that this page is allowed to be cached is 0 seconds. So this is the simplest thing that you can tell cache. It's also the one that you're supposed to use the least often. In fact, it is never, you'll never even see that in Drupal core. It's never used because it's pretty inefficient. The only time you'd use this is when you need to cache something over a period of time and there's no other way to know when things get outdated. So a clock is one good example of that, even though you're probably not going to do a clock this way. You'd do that client side anyway with JavaScript or something. But another reason you might do a max age is, let's say you're pulling content from a feed on another site on a page and you want to get the latest news. You probably wouldn't say 0, but you might say, I want to cache this for no longer than an hour. So maybe this max age is 60 times 60 seconds times 60 seconds per minute. So 3,600 might be a reasonable number you'd put in there. But ideally, we don't use time at all. So the next example that I have here is we're going to have some content that depends on who the current user is. So right now we're just going to say the current user has an ID of, and then we're going to print out the ID. So it's 0 here for an anonymous user. I have, let's see, actually I should have copied that. Let's see. Example 5. Okay, this user has an ID of 3. And this user has an ID of, oops, I didn't update this number. Okay, so you can see up here who's logged in. And here is a different user logged in. So those should have different numbers. Oops. Okay, so these should all be different numbers showing, and they're not. I'm not going to close this one because I've got too many windows open and I'm getting confused. Okay, so they're both saying 3, and they shouldn't both be saying 3. Why are they saying 3? It's because we're caching it. We're caching that result. So obviously, if we were displaying sensitive user information, this would be really bad. If you're seeing the contents of my inbox or something. So we want to make sure that when we cache something that's related to the current user, we tell Drupal that. So here in example 6, I've fixed this. I've told Drupal that the context of the content that I am displaying is the current user. So now I can say, oops, no, I can't. I can say, go to 6 here, go to 6 here. So now in example 6, I can reload both of these and they have different IDs showing because we're caching those separately. So behind the scenes, what's happening here is if I reload this dynamic page cache, we have, how do I make this bigger? There we go. I guess I can't make it big enough. So I can do this. So we can see that I should sort by date created. Okay. This most recent one has this is not showing something quite as obvious as I was hoping it was going to show. But what this should be showing me is that the user's ID is included as part of the context of what's being saved. And why am I not seeing that? This is, again, what a live demo always ends up being, is me being confused. Okay. Oh, it must be hashed in there. But what's happening here is that a separate cache entry is being created for these different cases because they have different contexts. Oof. Okay. So context is talking about the situation the user is in when they view the page. So other contexts we might see include, we can go up to this API page. Anything that implements cache context interface is available to us. So for example, we can have something give a different result depending on whether we are on the front page of the site or not. That's an available context. Or we can say we want a different result depending on which theme we're viewing. Or we can say we have a different result for every for the path we're on. And this could be relevant if we were to say displaying a block. We could have a block, generally when we have a block, we have the same block on every page so it can cache every time, but maybe we're saying, hey, this block, it could actually be different on every page, and that's how you do that. There's another thing that we can use in addition to context. And for this example, I'm going to, in example 7, okay, so I can be done with these here. I can go to example 7. And I'll just do it here too. Okay, so here, what we're doing is we are loading a node and we are putting some output here on the page based on the content of that node. This is another thing you might do all the time. And the problem with this is that if I edit this to fix my error, that it was in fact awesome, now when I reload this page, I don't get that having changed because it's been cached. So if you don't understand caching, the first thing you might do is say, okay, well, I better put a max age of 0 on that. But the problem is now you're not ever caching this. And here, you're usually going to cache it. But whenever someone edits that page, not this page, but the page that the node that this data is coming from, I want this to change. So what we can do for that is we can use tags. We can say that this cache is tagged with this node ID. So I'm going to go to example 8 to demonstrate this. Okay, so now if I edit this and change it to medium and reload this page, it changes. Okay, so the point of confusion for most people at this point is, what's the difference between a context and a tag? Which is, it's not obvious from those words at all, but the difference is that context is what you use when you want to have multiple simultaneous things cached and deliver a different one to the user based on the context in which they ask for it. So like, I want to cache this block on page A and I want to cache this block on page B. And the results are different, but once I have those two copies, I don't want to keep reloading that. Whereas tags are related to time. They tell you when this cached content is no good anymore for anyone, I should scrap it and build new content. So by tagging this for node 2, it's saying this is good forever unless node 2 changes, in which case this is no good for anyone, throw it away. Also, the tag system is pretty smart, and by tagging this for node 2, we don't have to worry about the invalidation thing ourselves. Drupal knows whenever an entity is changed, make sure you invalidate everything that was tagged that way. You can also tag something if we were displaying like 3. So the obvious thing is you tag it with the thing you loaded. But what if we were to say, load everything of, I don't have an example of this and I probably should have, load everything of high deliciousness and show them all. We could tag that with all of the individual IDs of what we loaded, but the problem is if something else becomes delicious, it won't know to throw this away. So what we can also do is we can tag this for node list, which will say this should be thrown away. This is a list of nodes, and this should be thrown away whenever any node changes. So those two things are available. This is a pretty useful one though, and we could of course dynamically make that with a variable if we didn't know, if that was a parameter, which is more likely. So tags when we want to change this when some content changes, and context when we want to have multiple versions of this that display at different times. All right. So those are the biggest tools that we have. I think that the other things that I have are a little bit more esoteric, and I might go over them really quickly, but I want to make sure that I've covered this part well because it's the most useful. So we've only been talking about render arrays, but these same concepts, if you've got a block and you want to make sure it's cached at the right time, as long as it's in the render array you're returning from the block, you're good. There's also a blocks also have a method called get cache tags and get cache contexts. You can use those. This is a place where I'm a little fuzzy, but I believe from all of my research that they are effectively the same thing, that all those do is those get merged into the render array. So my preference is to keep everything in the render array, because that way I'm doing it the same way everywhere. That's a place where I am ready to be proven wrong, but I believe that as long as we're doing things in the render array, we're fine. In the database, you'll see this dynamic page cache is what we've been looking at, which has some more things in it now. They are not the only, that's not the only table called cache. And you might wonder what the rest of these things are. And the answer is that you can define, these are called cache bins, and you can define your own cache bins pretty easily if you want to in your code. I'm going to go over this super fast because it is frankly not something that most people are going to need, but it's good to know that it's there so that if you do need it, you can look up the details. So another way that we can cache things is, so let's say we have this this little controller that looks at the query string for a particular key and uses that in the result. So we're going to say example 9, something equals other thing. Okay, so what this is doing is taking our query string and putting it here in the result. If we change that query string, we're going to get the same, because that's going to come from the page cache. However, there's another kind of cache that we can do, which is we can, in our services file, we can define a new cache bin. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but just to say that all of this stuff right here never changes when you're making a new cache bin. This is the existing thing in Drupal core that knows how to create a cache bin. All you have to do is give it a name. And once you've given it a name, you have your own cache bin. how do you use one? Again, I'm going to go through this really quickly, so apologize for that, but I can maybe do a longer session at some other point if this is interesting to anyone. What you do is you ask for your service, and this would normally be injected, but again, just to keep this as a short example, we grab our cache and we say, we're going to get the cache that was labeled something, and our result is the data in there. Or if it doesn't already exist, we're going to do our work and then set that cache. So I'm just going to show you what happens when I do that. And I'm just going to show you in the database that once I refresh this, we now have a database table called caching demo that we didn't create. It just created for us when we created that service. And here's the key and here's the value stored in there. And that's all I had to do to make a custom cache table. That's a lot simpler than it was in Drupal 7. So again, the need for this is pretty, I mean, if you look at the other systems that use this, they're pretty intensive things, like the menu system, more intensive than most people are going to write when just managing a regular Drupal site or building custom modules. But the power is there if you need it, if you need something more than what the render cache does for you. So there's the crash course on the Drupal menu system, or the Drupal render system, cache system, 3rd time's a charm. And I hope that was useful. Are there any questions on that before we get to general stuff?
I just wanted to clarify, make sure, I'm pretty sure I'm understanding correctly, or just to reiterate, like when you use the tag node:2, that is a very different thing than the caching of node2 that Drupal is also doing, correct?
Yes, and that's a good point. So if we look in the entity cache table, there is a cache here for node2, which is all of this stuff. And actually, if I copy all of this, I mean, this is going to be hard to read because it's PHP serialized, but if I go to unserialized.com, and I'm going to unserialize this thing. This is what it is storing. Oh, that didn't show me nearly what I wanted to see. Did this work? Okay, yeah. So inside here are all these values that you'd expect in this piece of content. But also down here are its own, oh, I guess it's not, I'm not seeing it here where I'd expect to see it. Maybe I should look at in the table. Oh, yeah. This has its own tags. So even these other tables use the tag system. I guess I was half expecting to see node:2 here as a tag, but now I'm realizing there's no reason to have that as a tag because this is only going to change when, you know, the system that changes this already knows to get rid of this, so it doesn't need to retag it that way. But yeah, this is the tag system doesn't just apply to the dynamic page cache, it applies to everything. They all have these. And in fact, yeah, so here there's a view. This is a view, view content, and it is tagged with all of the nodes that are being displayed there, so that it knows that it needs to be refreshed when any of those change. Yeah. So yes, that's a good point, that is a different kind of cache.
For the node list,
Yeah.
is that looking at every node ever on the site, or is it, can you only like specify like a certain type or?
I believe that that is only every node. I don't think it gets more granular than that. So if you have content that is a listing of nodes, it will be refreshed when anything on the site is edited.
Okay.
Which is a limit on a really busy site. Obviously, you'd have to investigate some other methods of caching in those cases. But on a medium edited site, which is actually most sites out there, if you're making a few edits a day, that's not really a concern.
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you. As always, if you have ideas for future topics, please leave those in the comments on YouTube or on the Meetup group.